When Elvis Presley walked into RCA Studio B in Nashville at midnight on a cold November evening in 1966, nobody outside his inner circle knew what was about to happen. The studio was officially closed. The session wasn't on any schedule. There would be no press, no photographers, no Colonel Parker breathing down his neck about commercial viability. Just Elvis, a small group of musicians, and a stack of gospel songs that had been burning in his soul since childhood. For the next 8 hours, the biggest rock and roll star in the world would sing his heart out. Not for fame, not for money, not even for his fans. He would sing for God. And in doing so, he would reveal the truth that he'd been hiding from the world. Rock and roll was never his first love. Gospel was? This is the story of the night Elvis finally sang what he really wanted to sing, in the only way he wanted to sing it. Raw, real, and reverent. But what happened that night would remain a secret for years, because the world wasn't ready to accept that the king of rock and roll would rather be singing hymns. Nashville in November was cold and quiet. The country music industry had mostly shut down for the evening, studios dark, musicians heading home to their families. But Studio B, the legendary RCA facility where countless hits had been recorded, was about to come alive in a way that nobody expected. Elvis had called ahead, making arrangements through contacts who owed him favors. He'd paid for the studio time himself, in cash, under a pseudonym. He didn't want RCA executives knowing. He definitely didn't want Colonel Parker finding out. This session was off the books, off the record, and completely off-brand for what Elvis was supposed to be doing. He'd just finished another exhausting year of movie-making in Hollywood. Beach movies, musical comedies, films with forgettable plots and even more forgettable songs. Clambake. Easy Come, Easy Go. Double Trouble. Movies that made money but killed his artistic soul a little more each time. Movies where he played the same character over and over. The singing, charming rebel who always got the girl and always sang a song about cars or beaches or girls. Movies that were so far from who Elvis really was that sometimes he'd finish a day of filming and not recognize himself in the mirror. But tonight was different. Tonight, Elvis Presley was going to be Elvis Aaron Presley from Tupelo, Mississippi, the boy who grew up in the Assembly of God church, the boy who learned to sing by listening to gospel quartets, the boy whose favorite music wasn't rock and roll at all, it was hymns, spirituals, sacred songs that spoke to something deep in his soul that no amount of fame or money could reach. He arrived at the studio with just 4 people. His longtime friends, Red West and Charlie Hodge, and 2 gospel musicians who'd agreed to keep the session secret, pianist Floyd Kramer and guitarist Scotty Moore, who'd been with Elvis since the Sun Records days. No string sections, no background singers, no producers telling him what would sell. Just 5 men and their instruments and a shared love of gospel music. "You sure about this, boss?" Red asked as they unloaded equipment. "Colonel's gonna have a fit if he finds out." Elvis stopped, a guitar case in his hands, and looked at Red with an intensity that made his friend take a step back. "I don't care. I've been singing what everyone else wants me to sing for 10 years. Tonight, I'm singing for myself, for my mama's memory, for God. You understand?" Red nodded. He'd known Elvis long enough to know when his friend needed something on a soul-deep level. And whatever was driving Elvis tonight went deeper than anything Red had seen in years. They set up quickly. No elaborate microphone arrangements. No complex recording setups. Just simple, honest equipment positioned to capture honest music. Elvis picked up an acoustic guitar. Not one of the flashy ones he used on stage, but a worn, comfortable instrument that felt like home in his hands. "What do you want to start with?" Charlie asked, settling onto a stool with his own guitar. Elvis closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, there was something different in his face. Peace. Actual peace. something that had been missing from his expression for so long that Red almost didn't recognize it. "How great thou art," Elvis said softly. "We're starting with How Great Thou Art. But here's the shocking part. As Elvis began to sing that first hymn in the quiet Nashville studio, something happened that none of them expected. His voice transformed, not the Elvis voice that screamed and swaggered through rock and roll songs, not the smooth crooner voice from the movies. This was something else entirely. This was Elvis singing from a place so deep, so genuine, that the other musicians stopped playing just to listen. And in that moment, they all understood. They were witnessing the real Elvis Presley for the first time. "Oh Lord, my God, when I, in awesome wonder, consider all the worlds thy hands have made." The words filled the studio with a power that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with conviction. Elvis wasn't performing. He was worshiping. His eyes were closed, his face tilted up, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. Real tears. Not the manufactured emotion of a movie scene, but genuine feeling pouring out after years of being bottled up. When the song ended, nobody spoke for a long moment. Even the cynical studio engineers, who'd heard everything over the years, found themselves moved. One of them, a man named Bill, who'd worked with everyone from Johnny Cash to Roy Orbison, would later say it was the most powerful vocal performance he'd ever witnessed. "Again," Elvis said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to do it again. Better this time." They recorded How Great Thou Art 7 times that night. Not because Elvis wasn't getting it right, every take was extraordinary, but because he couldn't let it go. Because this song meant something to him that no rock and roll song ever could. Because this was the music he'd been born to sing. Between takes, Elvis talked more freely than he had in years about his mother, Gladys, who'd taken him to church every Sunday without fail. About singing in the choir as a boy, feeling the Holy Spirit move through the congregation. About lying in bed at night listening to gospel radio, memorizing every note, every inflection, every moment of pure emotion. "You know what I wanted to be when I was a kid?" Elvis asked, not really directing the question at anyone in particular. "A gospel singer. Not a rock and roll star. Not a movie star. I wanted to sing in a gospel quartet like the Blackwood Brothers or the Statesmen. That was my dream. Just 4 guys on a stage singing about Jesus, moving people's souls." "Why didn't you?" Scotty asked. Elvis laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "Because Sam Phillips heard me singing That's All Right, and everything changed. Because rock and roll made me famous. Because Colonel Parker saw dollar signs. Because the world wanted Elvis Presley the rebel, not Elvis Presley the gospel singer. This is where everything changed. Because what Elvis said next revealed the internal war he'd been fighting for his entire career. A war between what he loved and what made him famous. A war that was tearing him apart from the inside. "Sometimes I think I made a deal with the devil," Elvis said quietly, his fingers absently picking out a melody on his guitar. "Not literally, you know, but I got everything I ever wanted. Fame, money, girls, the whole world knowing my name. But I had to give up the one thing I wanted most, singing the music I actually love. Every time I record another movie soundtrack, every time I sing another song about cars or beaches, I feel like I'm betraying something. Betraying myself, betraying my mama, betraying God." The studio went silent. No one knew what to say. They'd all seen Elvis struggle with the emptiness of movie stardom, but they'd never heard him articulate it so clearly. "That's why we're here tonight," Elvis continued. "That's why this has to be secret. Because if the Colonel knew, if RCA knew, they'd try to turn this into something commercial. They'd want to market it as Elvis Does Gospel, or some gimmick. But this isn't a gimmick. This is my soul, man. This is the real me. And I needed to do this. I needed to sing these songs the way they're meant to be sung, without any bullshit about demographics or radio play, or what teenagers want to hear." Charlie leaned forward. "So what happens to these recordings?" Elvis shrugged. I don't know. Maybe nothing? Maybe we just did this for us, for tonight. Or maybe someday, when I've got the courage, I'll release them. Let people hear the real Elvis Presley for once. They moved on to other songs. Peace in the Valley. Crying in the Chapel. Where No One Stands Alone. Each one recorded with that same intensity, that same genuine emotion. Between takes, Elvis would tell stories about the songs, where he'd first heard them, what they meant to him, how they'd gotten him through dark times. Where No One Stands Alone, Elvis said, strumming the opening chords. My mama used to sing this around the house. After she died in '58, I couldn't listen to it for years. It hurt too much. But then one night in '63, I was in Graceland, feeling so alone I could barely breathe. All these people around me all the time, but I felt completely isolated. And this song came on the radio, and I realized I'm never really alone. God's there, Mama's there, watching from heaven. And that's what this song means to me. It's about knowing that even when everyone else leaves, even when fame goes away, even when the crowd stops screaming, you're never truly alone. You haven't seen the biggest surprise yet, because around 3 a.m. something happened that none of them could have predicted. Elvis asked everyone to leave the studio except Charlie. Just the two of them, one guitar, no recording equipment running. What happened in that private moment would only be revealed years later. I need to sing one more, Elvis told Charlie. But this one's just for me, not for any recording, not for anyone else, just me and God. Charlie nodded and quietly played as Elvis sang His Hand in Mine, a cappella. No microphone, no recording, just Elvis's voice in that empty studio, singing to an audience of one. And as he sang, something broke loose in him. Years of frustration, years of feeling fake, years of playing a role, it all came pouring out in those lyrics. His voice cracked, he sobbed, and he kept singing through it all. When he finished, he sat down on the floor, his back against the wall, and cried like a child. Charlie sat next to him, saying nothing, just being present. After about 20 minutes, Elvis spoke. You know what the saddest part is? Tomorrow I go back to Hollywood, back to being Elvis Presley, back to singing songs I hate in movies I'm embarrassed by, back to pretending I'm happy. And in a few weeks, everyone will have forgotten about tonight. It'll be like it never happened. We'll remember, Charlie said. And God will remember. Elvis looked at him. Will he? Sometimes I wonder if God even recognizes me anymore. I've strayed so far from what I was raised to be. I'm not sure the boy my mama raised still exists. He exists, Charlie said firmly. He's sitting right here. That boy doesn't live on movie screens or album covers. He lives in moments like this. When you sing these songs, when you remember where you came from. Elvis nodded slowly. I want to do this again, soon. More gospel sessions. Real ones. Maybe I'll even release an album. A real gospel album. Not some Hollywood cash grab. Something genuine. Wait, don't miss this crucial detail. What Elvis didn't know that night was that someone had been recording the entire session without his knowledge. The studio engineer, Bill, had been so moved by what he was hearing that he'd quietly kept the tape running the whole time. Years later, those secret recordings would surface, and the world would finally hear the Elvis that only his closest friends knew existed. The Elvis who sang with pure passion, unfiltered by commercial concerns or image management. By 4 a.m., they were exhausted but elated. They'd recorded 17 songs, 17 perfect, honest, emotional gospel songs. Elvis looked more alive than any of them had seen him in years. Thank you, he said to each of them individually, shaking hands, pulling them into hugs. Thank you for this, for keeping this secret, for letting me be me for one night. As they packed up to leave, Red pulled Elvis aside. You okay, boss? Elvis smiled, a real smile, not the movie star smirk. Yeah, I'm okay. Better than okay. For the first time in years, I feel like I actually did something that mattered. Not for money, not for fame, just for my soul. What you're seeing now is nothing compared to what happened in the aftermath of that secret session. Because that one night in Nashville would set off a chain of events that would define the rest of Elvis's career in ways nobody expected. Elvis did record more gospel music after that night. In 1967, he released How Great Thou Art, the album that came from that secret session and others like it. It was the only music he ever recorded that he was truly, completely proud of. And in 1974, when he won his first competitive Grammy Award, it wasn't for rock and roll. It was for that gospel album. Standing on stage accepting that Grammy, Elvis cried. Not theatrical Hollywood tears, but real tears of validation. The world had finally recognized him for singing what he loved. But the tragedy is that even with that recognition, Elvis still couldn't escape the machine. Colonel Parker still pushed him toward rock and roll in movies. The industry still saw him as Elvis the Rebel, not Elvis the Gospel Singer. And Elvis still felt trapped, still felt like he was living a lie. In his final years, when addiction and depression were consuming him, Elvis would often retreat to gospel music. He'd gather his entourage in Graceland's living room and make them sing hymns with him for hours. Those were the only times, people would later say, that he seemed truly at peace. Not performing, not trying to be anyone, just singing the music he loved with no audience but God. You won't believe this, but in the days before his death in August 1977, Elvis spent hours at the piano in Graceland playing gospel songs. His last complete sentence, according to his girlfriend Ginger Alden, was, "I'm going to the bathroom to read." But earlier that evening, he'd been at the piano singing Unchained Melody and several hymns. The last music Elvis Presley ever made wasn't rock and roll. It was gospel. Hold on. This is when it gets real. Because the legacy of Elvis's secret gospel sessions goes far beyond those recordings. It's about what they represent. A man fighting to maintain his authentic self in an industry that wanted him to be a product. A man who achieved everything society says should make you happy, but found his only peace in the music he wasn't famous for. After Elvis died, those who knew him best would always come back to one truth. Elvis Presley was happiest when he was singing gospel. Not on stage in Las Vegas with thousands screaming. Not in Hollywood making another forgettable movie, but in quiet moments, in church, in late-night sessions with friends, singing songs about grace and redemption and faith. That was the real Elvis. Everything else was just the costume he had to wear to make a living. The secret gospel session of 1966 became legendary among Elvis historians. When the bootleg recordings finally surfaced in the 1980s, they revealed something that shocked even die-hard fans. Elvis's best vocal performances weren't his hits. They were his hymns. The power, the emotion, the sheer artistry in those gospel recordings surpassed anything he'd done in rock and roll. It was as if he'd saved his true voice, his authentic self, for the music he really loved. Music critics who analyzed those recordings noted something fascinating. In his rock and roll songs, Elvis was always performing, playing a character, projecting an image, but in his gospel recordings, he disappeared. There was no Elvis Presley singing. There was just a man with an extraordinary voice, using that gift to worship. The persona fell away, and what remained was raw, honest humanity connecting with the divine. Religious scholars studied Elvis's gospel work and found depth that surprised them. These weren't just renditions of familiar hymns. Elvis brought personal interpretation, emotional nuance, and genuine spiritual seeking to every note. He understood these songs not as performance pieces, but as theological statements, as prayers set to music. And that understanding elevated them beyond mere entertainment into something approaching sacred art. But here's the truth. Elvis never got to fully embrace that side of himself publicly. The world wanted Elvis the rock and roll king, The industry needed Elvis the movie star. His management demanded Elvis the money maker, and the real Elvis, the one who just wanted to sing gospel music with his friends, got pushed further and further into the background until he almost disappeared entirely. The night of that secret session, Elvis had been free. For 8 hours, he'd been exactly who he wanted to be. He'd sung exactly what he wanted to sing. He'd connected with the part of himself that no amount of fame or money could corrupt. And then the sun came up, and he had to put the mask back on. He had to be Elvis again. And that dichotomy between who he was and who he had to pretend to be would haunt him for the rest of his life. Years later, musicians who worked with Elvis on his gospel recordings would talk about the transformation they witnessed, how he'd come into the studio looking tired and worn down by the weight of being Elvis Presley. But the moment they started a hymn, his entire demeanor would change. His shoulders would relax, his face would soften, and that voice, that incredible, one-of-a-kind voice, would pour out with a purity and power that made everyone in the room believe in something bigger than themselves. It was like watching someone take off armor, one musician recalled. All day, every day, Elvis wore this protective shell because he had to. But when he sang gospel, the armor came off. He was vulnerable. He was real. He was home. That's what gospel music was for Elvis. Home. Not Graceland, the physical building. Not Memphis, the city. But the spiritual home he'd known as a child in Tupelo, when he was just Elvis, a poor kid who loved to sing in church. Before the fame, before the money, before the world decided who he should be. The tragedy of Elvis Presley isn't that he died at 42. It's that he spent most of his adult life being prevented from doing the one thing that brought him genuine joy, singing gospel music without commercial pressure or image concerns. It's that he achieved a level of success most people can only dream of. But that success became a prison that kept him from his true passion. But the beauty of Elvis Presley, and this is what that secret session revealed, is that despite everything, despite the industry and the pressure and the need to maintain an image, he never stopped fighting for those moments of authenticity. He carved out secret sessions. He recorded gospel albums even when they weren't expected to sell as well as rock and roll. He won Grammys for sacred music when everyone expected him to be honored for secular hits. He held onto that part of himself with everything he had. The recordings from that midnight session in Nashville still exist. If you listen carefully, really carefully, you can hear something in Elvis's voice that's absent from almost all his other recordings. You can hear freedom. You can hear joy. You can hear a man singing exactly what he wants to sing, exactly how he wants to sing it, with no concern for anything except honoring the music and the God he believed gave him his gift. That's the real Elvis Presley, not the hip swiveling rebel on the Ed Sullivan Show, not the movie star in Hawaii, not even the jumpsuited icon in Las Vegas. The real Elvis was the one singing "How Great Thou Art" at 2 a.m. in an empty Nashville studio, tears streaming down his face, pouring his soul into a hymn that would never be a hit, but meant everything to him. And maybe that's the lesson of Elvis's secret gospel obsession. Maybe the things that make us happiest, the things that feel most authentic to who we really are, aren't always the things the world rewards or recognizes. Maybe true success isn't measured in record sales or movie deals or sold-out shows. Maybe it's measured in moments like that midnight session. Moments when we get to be fully, completely ourselves, doing what we love, with no audience but God. Elvis Presley spent his life chasing that feeling, those moments of pure authenticity. He found them in gospel music. He found them in that Nashville studio at midnight. He found them in quiet hymns sung with friends. And in those moments, he wasn't Elvis Presley, superstar. He was Elvis Aaron Presley, a boy from Tupelo who loved God and loved to sing. And that more than any #1 hit or Hollywood movie, was who he really was. The world remembers Elvis for rock and roll. History books call him the king. But if you'd asked Elvis what he was most proud of, what music he wanted to be remembered for, he would have pointed to those gospel recordings, because that was his truth, that was his passion, that was his soul. And on one cold November night in Nashville in 1966, for 8 perfect hours, Elvis got to live that truth completely. No compromises, no commercial considerations, no image management, just a man and his music and his God. And if you listen to those recordings, really listen, you can hear it. You can hear the sound of a soul finally singing what it was meant to sing. That's the night Elvis sang for God, not fans. That's the night the king of rock and roll revealed who he really wanted to be. That's the night a secret was kept that should have been shouted from the rooftops. Elvis Presley's greatest music wasn't the music that made him famous. It was the music he sang in secret, late at night, when no one was watching except the one who mattered most. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever had to hide your true passion because it didn't fit your image? Do you think Elvis should have fought harder to sing what he loved? What matters more, commercial success or artistic authenticity? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of Elvis Presley, the music he truly loved, and the man behind the legend. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story about the king of rock and roll.